So far in our discussion of Paul's letter to the congregations in the Roman province of Galatia, we've talked about some of the thematic elements you find in chapters 1, 2, and 3. We've talked about the danger of compromise. We've talked about the problem when compromise actually turns into hypocrisy. In chapter 3, and even parts of chapter 2 together, we've even talked about the absence of innocence on the part of individuals that actually are viewing things in a very erroneous way. I'd like to talk about chapter 4. And if we discuss chapter 4, we're going to go back and begin with a few things in chapter 3. I really want to talk about the idea of not returning to worthless principles. There's a statement in verse number 9 of chapter 4. After you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage? That's the way the New King James reads. But that phrase, weak and beggarly elements, the English Standard Version says return to the worthless principles. Not weak and beggarly elements, but weak and worthless principles. In the NIV, the statement is weak and miserable principles. So Paul is writing to these Christians saying, okay, you have a freedom in Christ and you're wanting to give that up for what? So what's the discussion? And why would I go back and view some things in chapter 3? Keep in mind that when these books were written, they were not divided into chapter and verse. It's like you're receiving a letter from a colleague or from a relative. They don't divide it into numbered verses when they're writing a letter. In fact, one paragraph typically leads into the next. And if you're reading a letter from your best friend, you don't read one sentence and then say, I'll read the rest of it next week. Or one sentence a week until I finish the entire thing. One of the disadvantages of the way that the Bible has been preserved for us is chapter and verse, because we tend to isolate some of those passages instead of taking them together. Back in chapter 3, in chapter 3 and verse 24, Paul wrote that the law of Moses was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. And the word translated tutor is not a really good translation of that Greek term. Perhaps the best, again, is the English Standard Version, which is a fairly recent English translation. It's a guardian. The law of Moses was our guardian to bring us to faith, to bring us to Christ. Because the Greek word actually pictured in those affluent households in the Roman society. A servant actually was in charge of taking the heir of the estate by the hand and making sure that that child made it to school, made sure that that child was learning things at home. It was the task of that guardian to make sure that this child grew up in a way where he could inherit the estate. And then beginning in chapter 4, he goes back and talks about this idea of an heir. Verse number 1. I said that the heir, as long as he is a child, does not differ at all from a servant, though he is master of all, but is under guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the father. Even so, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons, the heir. From that child to one who has grown close to adulthood or reached adulthood, where they are responsible enough to be the recipient of the estate. But as that child, there's so many things to learn. And it's actually the picture that Paul paints for us in this chapter. So in verse number 3, when we were children, we were in bondage. In verse number 7 of this chapter, chapter 4, therefore you are no longer a servant, but a son. If a son, then an heir of God through Christ. You've grown up. And then that statement in verse number 9, but now after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and worthless elements to which you desire to again be in bondage? And the picture is the child that has grown up and now is responsible enough to take over the estate, receive that inheritance. But no, he doesn't want to do that. He wants to go back and be under the tutelage of that guardian. He wants to be at the mercy of that servant. He wants to be under the thumb of those individuals that will make decisions for him. It's as though he cannot make decisions on himself, or she cannot make decisions by herself. There's the problem. And the situation continues down in verse number 16 with everything that Paul has mentioned to them. You don't need to go back to something that was binding, it was bound upon you, and you're bound by it in so many different ways. That binding is something that's been removed with that gospel message of Jesus the Christ, which far excels the law of Moses. So in verse 16, have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Interesting question. And then verse 17, they zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you, that you may be zealous for them. Who's the they and who's the them? Paul has been dealing from the very first chapter of individuals that are trying to change the message of Jesus into something different. They're trying to say that you've got to actually follow the law of Moses as well. Commentaries classify those, historians classify those as teachers that have a Judaic mindset. Judaizing teachers is actually a phrase that you find. With those kind of things in mind, in those two verses, verse 16 to verse 17, what have scholars stated over the past about those particular phrases? To begin with, Linsky makes this observation, again on this passage in Galatians. Well, they say Paul has become hostile to us, but it is the best and truest friend who honestly tells us the truth about ourselves, even when he knows that we shall not like it. But then he follows up with this statement. False friends are the ones who hide such truth from us and do so in order to remain in our favor. It's like they don't want both sides of the issue actually being out in the open. They want to limit the talking points of a particular topic, a particular teaching, a particular doctrine, a particular ideology. Speech that is censored. Sound familiar? He talks about this zealousness. The entire zealous concern of the Judaizers is that they want to lock up the Galatians in order to the Galatians zealously seek only them. Don't want them thinking for themselves. Interesting observation. The statement that's made by Hendrickson in his commentary on Galatians, another interesting statement. The Judaizers, those who are trying to place a lot of restrictions upon the Gentile Christians, are trying to curry the favor with the Galatians, ostensibly being deeply concerned about them. However, their purpose is not commendable. Their motivation is not honorable. Their real object is to exclude the Galatians, that is, to shut them out from all influences except their own, particularly, of course, to isolate them from any effect Paul and his associates might have upon them. Once these opponents have succeeded in deluding the minds of the Galatians with an untrue image of Paul and of his message, the sadly deluded ones will then become wholly dependent upon these detractors of the true gospel. Their zeal for the truth, the Galatians, their zeal for the truth has subsided. Their loyalty was in the process of being transferred from Paul to the proponents of dangerous error. Everything was fine as long as Paul had been present with them, but once he was gone and the distorters of the true gospel had arrived, the alienation of affection had begun to their own hurt. Interesting observation. Ernest Campbell, in his commentary on Galatians, writes this. Not only were the Judaizers selfishly motivated, but their desire was to actually shut the Galatians out. The Greek word means to lock out, to prevent from entering. Since Paul was speaking about the truth in the previous verse, verse 16, it logically follows that they were trying to shut out the Galatians out from the truth. The truth is the gospel, chapter 2 and verse 5, which Judaizers were perverting and twisting, chapter 1, verse 7. To the extent that the Judaizers were successful in preventing the Galatians from entering into the truth, that salvation is by grace through faith, to this extent they would have potential followers who would be zealously seeking them, supporting them, adding prestige to their infamous cause, and strengthening their numerical position. Again, interesting comment. And finally, a statement that's made by Hugh Ridderbos in his commentary on Galatians. The apostle introduces a third party into the argument, beyond doubt the heretical teachers. He's talking about their motives. They are making a play for the confidence of the Galatians and for a favorite attitude. This happens in no good way. That is, it's not based on good intentions. The object that they very consciously have in mind is to shut out the Galatians. They want to isolate the churches, cut them off from other influences. The zeal which they pour into this effort is purely egotistical. They do so that the Galatians may seek after them. For the moment, they are zealously bidding for the favorable attention of the Gentiles, of the Galatians, in order, after a while, to lord it over them. They want to put the Galatian Christians in bondage, away from the truth of the message. How do you do that? You censor the message. How do you do that? You actually defame those who actually been teaching them prior to this influence by this very austere group of individuals. Return to worthless kind of principles, meaningless kind of principles, things that keep one in bondage. Chapter 5, we'll close with the very beginning, the first verse of chapter 5, because it's really a conclusion to chapter 4. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Now, while Paul is addressing a religious situation where individuals are trying to subvert the message of Jesus and bind things upon the populace around them who've embraced Jesus, and they don't like the fact that they are losing their grip on the religious world, and they'll do anything and everything they can to maintain it. The application beyond religion in this chapter and with these principles should be as plain as the nose in anybody's face. And it is sad that our world has turned into the same kind of mindset socially, politically, as the Judaizing teachers in Galatians chapter 4 had demonized Christianity and religion in that regard. Interesting book. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.